Every voice you listen to shapes your future, but the most powerful voice you hear every single day is not your boss, your parents, or society, it's your own. And here's the uncomfortable truth: if that voice is negative, it doesn't just comment on your life, it controls it. Most people don't fail because they lack talent, intelligence, or opportunity. They fail because they quietly talk themselves out of their own potential. They doubt before they try. They criticize before they act. They give up internally long before the world ever says no. But what if negative self-talk isn't who you are? What if it's simply a habit learned, repeated, and reinforced over time? And if it's a habit, then it can be unlearned, rewired, replaced. Stay with this message until the end, because these aren't just motivational ideas. These are rules, practical principles that change how your mind works, how you make decisions, and how you show up in the world. One rule might shift your thinking. All 10 can change your life. Negative self-thinking doesn't come from nowhere, and the moment you truly understand that, its power over you begins to weaken. That inner voice that questions you, doubts you, and sometimes criticizes you is not random, and it is not proof that something is wrong with you. It exists for a reason. It was formed to protect you from failure, from rejection, from embarrassment, from emotional pain. Long before you ever thought about success, confidence, or purpose, your brain was designed for one primary job: survival. Survival means avoiding danger, minimizing risk, and keeping you safe from anything that could cause harm. In the modern world, danger rarely looks like physical threats, but your brain doesn't know the difference. It treats social rejection, public failure, and uncertainty as if they were life or death situations. So when you step towards something new, meaningful, or uncomfortable, your brain responds the only way it knows how: it creates doubt. That doubt sounds like logic, but it isn't. It sounds like realism, but it's actually fear dressed up as reason. When your mind says, what if you fail, or you're not ready, or this could go wrong, it is not predicting the future. It is trying to keep you within familiar boundaries. Familiar feels safe even when it's limiting. The brain would rather keep you stuck in a known discomfort than allow you to face an unknown possibility. This is why negative self-talk often grows louder right before growth. It shows up when you're about to apply for something bigger, speak up, take a risk, or change direction. It shows up not because you are incapable, but because you are about to leave the comfort zone your brain has memorized. Understanding this changes everything, because it reframes the relationship you have with that voice. Instead of fighting it, hating it, or trying to silence it with force, you begin to recognize it for what it truly is: a misguided protector. It is trying to help, but it's using outdated information. It learned its job from past experiences, old failures, moments of embarrassment, and times when things didn't work out. It learned patterns and decided, let's not do that again. The problem is that growth requires you do things again differently, better, and with more awareness. If you blindly obey that inner voice, you live according to past data, not present potential. When you know why the voice shows up, you stop believing everything it says. You begin to pause. You begin to observe. Instead of reacting emotionally, you respond thoughtfully. You can say, I hear you, but I know what this is. That simple awareness creates space between you and the thought. And in that space, you regain choice. The thought may still appear, but it no longer controls your behavior. It becomes information, not instruction. Most people make the mistake of assuming that confident, successful individuals don't have negative thoughts. That assumption keeps them trapped. The truth is, everyone has that voice. The difference is not in its absence, but in how it's interpreted. Those who move forward have learned not to confuse fear with truth. They understand that discomfort is not a stop sign. It's a signal that something meaningful is happening. They don't ask, why am I afraid? As if fear is a flaw. They ask, what is this fear trying to protect me from? And is that protection still necessary? When you see negative self-thinking as protection rather than sabotage, your relationship with yourself softens. You stop attacking yourself for having doubts. You stop adding shame to fear. Shame multiplies fear, understanding dissolves it. Compassion becomes a tool for clarity, not an excuse for inaction. You begin to say, of course I'm scared, this matters. And when something matters, fear is often part of the process. This awareness also allows you to distinguish between intuition and insecurity. Intuition is calm, clear, and grounded. It speaks once and doesn't panic. Insecurity is loud, repetitive, and urgent. It demands certainty before action and perfection before progress. When you understand the source of negative self-talk, you can tell which voice deserves attention and which one needs reassurance, not obedience, reassurance. Rewiring the mind does not begin with positivity. It begins with understanding. You cannot replace a thought you don't understand. You cannot change a pattern you haven't recognized. When you know that negative self-thinking is rooted in survival, you stop personalizing it. It's not a flaw in your character, it's a feature of your biology. And features can be managed. Each time that voice shows up and you respond with awareness instead of fear, you teach your brain something new. You show it that risk does not automatically lead to danger. You show it that discomfort does not equal destruction. Over time, the voice softens, not because it disappears, but because it learns. The brain adapts to evidence. When you survive risks, grow through challenges, and recover from mistakes, you update the system. You retrain the protector. The real shift happens when you stop asking, how do I get rid of negative thoughts? And start asking, how do I understand them? Because once you understand them, they lose their authority. They become background noise instead of commands. And in that moment, you move from being controlled by fear to being guided by purpose. A feeling is not a fact, but most people live as if it is. The moment a feeling shows up, they accept it as truth, as identity, as destiny. I feel insecure. I feel afraid, so I must be weak. I feel lost, so I must be failing. And just like that, a temporary emotional state turns into a permanent label. This is where power is lost, not in the feeling itself, but in the confusion between who you are and what you feel. Feelings or experiences, they are weather systems passing through the mind. But somewhere along the way, people started building houses in the storm and calling it home. The truth is, feelings are reactions, not definitions. They are signals, not commands. They rise in response to circumstances, memories, expectations, and fears, and then they fall if you let them. But when you fuse your identity to them, you trap yourself. You hand over the steering wheel of your life to something that was never meant to drive. Emotions are powerful, yes, but they are not wise. They don't see the full picture. They don't care about your long-term future. They care about comfort in the moment, about safety right now, about avoiding pain at all costs. And if you listen to them as if they are facts, they will keep you small. Think about fear. Fear is one of the most misunderstood emotions. Fear shows up to protect you, not to define you. It is your brain saying, pay attention. But instead of listening and then deciding, most people surrender. They say, I feel fear, so I should stop. They confuse the presence of fear with the absence of ability. But courage has never been the absence of fear. Courage is the decision to move forward while fear is speaking. When you say, I am afraid, and stop there, fear becomes your identity. When you say, I feel fear, and I am still moving, fear becomes just noise in the background. The same is true for inadequacy. Feeling inadequate does not mean you are inadequate. It means you are stretching beyond what is familiar. Growth always triggers discomfort. If you never felt inadequate, it would mean you never tried anything meaningful. But many people feel that discomfort and conclude, I'm not good enough. That conclusion is not evidence-based, it's emotion-based. It's the mind trying to pull you back to safety. When you step back and observe the feeling instead of becoming it, you can say, this feeling is here because I am evolving. That shift alone changes everything. The feeling loses its authority the moment you stop treating it like a verdict. There is a critical difference between experiencing an emotion and being consumed by it. When you identify as your emotions, they run your life, your decisions become reactions, your future becomes limited by your mood. On good days, you feel unstoppable. On bad days, you feel worthless. That is not stability, that is emotional slavery. But when you learn to observe your emotions, to name them without becoming them, you step into control. You create space between the stimulus and the response, and in that space, freedom lives. Observation is power. The moment you can say, I notice that I am feeling anxious, instead of I am anxious, something shifts. You become the observer, not the prisoner. You are no longer drowning in the emotion, you are watching it move through you. This doesn't mean you suppress feelings or pretend they don't exist. It means you acknowledge them without letting them define you. Suppression is denial, observation is mastery. One weakens you, the other strengthens you. Your mind produces thoughts the same way your lungs produce breath. Not every thought is intentional, and not every thought is true. Yet most people treat every thought as if it came from some higher authority. I'm not ready. I'll fail. People will judge me. These are thoughts, not prophecies. You are not the thought. You are the thinker of the thought. That distinction is the foundation of mental strength. The moment you realize that thoughts arise automatically, you stop worshiping them. You start questioning them. And once you question them, they lose their grip. Control does not come from eliminating negative feelings. It comes from refusing to obey them blindly. Life will always present moments of doubt, fear, anger, and sadness. That is not a flaw in the system. That is the human experience. The problem begins when those moments become identities. When I feel broken, turns into I am broken. When I feel behind, turns into I am a failure. These identities become self-fulfilling prisons. People act in alignment with who they believe they are. Change the belief and behavior follows. Separating who you are from what you feel, act based on values instead of emotions. Values are stable. Emotions are not. If you wait to feel confident before taking action, you will wait forever. Confidence is not a prerequisite, it is a result. Action comes first. Discipline comes before motivation. Movement creates clarity. When you act according to your principles, even while your emotions protest, you build self-respect. And self-respect is far more powerful than temporary comfort. There will be days when you feel tired, unmotivated, unsure, and overwhelmed. Those feelings will tell you to slow down, to quit, to postpone your potential. But feelings don't get to decide your future. You do. You can acknowledge them without obeying them. You can say, I see you, but you don't get to drive today. That is not cruelty to yourself, that is leadership. And the most important person you will ever lead is yourself. When you stop identifying with every emotion, you stop being controlled by external circumstances. A bad conversation doesn't ruin your day. A setback doesn't destroy your confidence. A moment of doubt doesn't erase your worth. You become anchored, grounded, stable. Not because life gets easier, but because you get stronger. You learn that emotions are visitors, not residents. They knock, they speak, and then they leave if you don't invite them to stay. Master this separation and you reclaim your power. You stop asking, how do I feel? And start asking, what do I choose? You stop being ruled by inner noise and start acting from inner clarity. And once you understand, truly understand that you are not your feelings, not your thoughts, not your momentary fears, you unlock a level of control most people never reach. You become the one who decides even when the mind is loud, even when the heart is heavy, even when the path feels uncertain. That is strength. The phrase, I can't, sounds harmless, but it is one of the most powerful limitations a person can place on themselves. It doesn't just describe inability, it declares finality. It tells the brain that the conversation is over. That exploration is unnecessary, that effort is pointless. The mind hears, I can't, as a command to stop searching for solutions, and the brain obeys. It shuts doors, lowers energy, and retreats to what feels safe. But the truth is, most I can't statements are not statements of fact, they are statements of fear, frustration, or unfamiliarity disguised as certainty. The brain is designed to learn, adapt, and rewire itself. It thrives on challenge when challenge is framed as progress rather than threat. When you say, I can't, you present the task as a threat to your identity. Failure feels permanent, mistakes feel dangerous. But when you say, I'm learning, you transform the same task into a process. There is room to be imperfect. There is permission to try, to stumble, to adjust. The brain relaxes because it no longer has to protect you from a final judgment. It can do what it was built to do, experiment, grow, and improve. Language is not just communication, it is instruction. Every word you say to yourself is a direction given to your nervous system. I can't tightens the body, narrows attention, and lowers motivation. I'm learning opens the mind, widens perspective, and increases resilience. This shift does not require pretending things are easy. It does not deny difficulty. It simply removes the false belief that difficulty equals incapability. Struggle is not proof that you are failing, it is proof that you are engaged in something meaningful. Confidence is often misunderstood as the starting point for growth. People wait to feel confident before they act, believing confidence will somehow appear first. But confidence is built through evidence, and evidence comes from action. Curiosity is what gets you moving before confidence arrives. When you say, I'm learning, you replace the pressure to perform with the permission to explore. Curiosity asks better questions than fear ever will. It asks, what happens if I try again? What can this teach me? What's one small improvement I can make today? These questions keep you moving forward even when results are slow. The identity shift that comes with this language change is subtle but profound. I can't belongs to an identity that avoids challenges to stay comfortable. It protects the ego by avoiding the risk of failure. I'm learning belongs to an identity that grows through challenges. It understands that the ego does not need protection, it needs development. When you identify as a learner, mistakes stop being personal attacks and start being information. Feedback stops being rejection and starts being guidance. The world becomes a classroom instead of a courtroom. This shift also changes how you respond to setbacks. With an I can't mindset, a setback feels like confirmation of inadequacy. One mistake becomes a reason to quit. But with an I'm learning mindset, setbacks are expected. They are part of the curriculum. You don't interpret them as signs to stop. You interpret them as signals to adjust. You become more patient with yourself, not because you lower your standards, because you raise your understanding of how growth actually works. The brain resists finality because finality equals stagnation. When something is labeled as impossible, the brain stops allocating resources to it. But when something is labeled as learnable, the brain stays engaged. It searches for patterns, strategies, and improvements. This is why people who succeed long-term are not necessarily the most talented. They are the most adaptable. They do not ask, can I do this? They ask, how can I get better at this? That single question keeps them in motion when others stop. Replacing I can't with I'm learning also changes how you see other people. Instead of comparing yourself and feeling behind, you start studying. Instead of envy, you feel interest. Instead of discouragement, you feel direction. Other people's success becomes proof of what is possible, not evidence of your inadequacy. You realize that mastery is not a personality trait. It is the result of repeated learning cycles over time. This language shift requires honesty. I'm learning does not mean I will succeed instantly. It means I am willing to stay in the process. It means choosing progress over perfection. It means showing up again after a bad day. It means understanding that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is not a reason to quit. It is the reason to learn. Every expert was once confused. Every strong performer was once inconsistent. Every confident person was once unsure. When you adopt the identity of a learner, effort becomes meaningful. You stop measuring your worth by outcomes and start measuring it by engagement. Did you try? Did you reflect? Did you improve even slightly? These become the metrics that matter. And over time, those small improvements compound into competence, and competence turns into confidence. Not the loud, fragile confidence that disappears under pressure, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can figure things out. The most powerful part of replacing I can't with I'm learning is that it returns choice to your hands. I can't removes responsibility by declaring a fixed limit. I'm learning accepts responsibility by acknowledging potential. It says, this is hard, but I'm capable of growth. That belief alone changes how you show up. You take more risks. You persist longer. You recover faster. And without realizing it, you become the kind of person who does things you once believed were impossible. Growth does not demand certainty. It demands willingness. The willingness to look foolish to be slow, to be imperfect, and to continue anyway. Every time you catch yourself saying, I can't, and replace it with, I'm learning, you reopen the path forward. You remind your brain that this is not the end of the story. It is the middle. And in the middle, change is always possible. Every negative thought you experience arrives wearing the costume of truth, but most of the time it is nothing more than a story you have told yourself so often that it feels real. The mind is a powerful narrator. It takes fragments of past experiences, emotions, and fears, and stitches them together into a storyline about who you are and what will happen next. I'm not good enough. People will judge me. I always fail. These sentences feel factual because they are familiar, not because they are accurate. Familiarity tricks the brain into certainty. Repetition turns assumption into belief, and belief quietly shapes behavior. The problem is not that these thoughts exist. The problem is that they go unquestioned. The mind speaks, and we listen as if it were an unbiased reporter of reality. But the mind is not neutral. It is biased toward protection. It exaggerates risk. It recalls failure more vividly than success. It predicts rejection faster than acceptance. Not because it is malicious, but because it is wired to keep you safe. When it senses uncertainty, it creates stories designed to reduce exposure, avoid embarrassment, and prevent pain. The issue begins when you mistake those protective stories for facts. Every time you think, I'm not good enough, pause and ask based on what evidence? Not based on feeling, not based on one mistake, not based on someone else's opinion. Evidence, most of the time there is none. There is memory, emotion, and assumption, but no proof. The statement collapses under scrutiny. You may not be perfect, you may not be finished, you may not be where you want to be yet, but not good enough is a sweeping conclusion that ignores growth, context, and effort. It is a story that simplifies reality to justify hesitation. People will judge me is another common narrative. It feels true because judgment has happened before. But the mind takes isolated incidents and turns them into universal laws. It assumes the future will behave exactly like the past without accounting for change. It also exaggerates how much attention others are actually paying. Most people are too busy managing their own insecurities to study yours. Yet the mind repeats the story so often that it feels inevitable. The result is self-censorship. You speak less, try less, and hide more, not because judgment is guaranteed, but because the story says it is. I always fail might be the most damaging story of all. It erases nuance. It ignores partial success. It dismisses learning. It defines you by moments instead of movement. No one always fails. Failure is situational, not personal. But when the mind repeats this narrative, it trains you to expect defeat before you begin. Expectations influence effort. Effort influences outcome. And suddenly the story starts creating the very results it predicts. Not because it was true, but because it was believed. This is why one simple question is so powerful. Is this proven or is this assumed? That question interrupts the automatic flow of negative self-talk. It forces the mind to slow down. It shifts you from emotional reaction to rational observation. Most negative thoughts cannot survive this level of inspection. They rely on speed, not strength. They need to be accepted quickly without resistance. The moment you pause and challenge them, they weaken. The mind does not believe reality, it believes repetition. Whatever you tell yourself consistently becomes familiar, and whatever is familiar becomes comfortable, even if it is painful. This is why people stay stuck in negative identities for years. Not because the identity is accurate, but because it is rehearsed. The brain builds neural pathways around repeated thoughts. The more often you think something, the easier it becomes to think it again. Over time, it feels automatic. Breaking that cycle does not require replacing thoughts with blind positivity. It requires questioning the story. When you challenge a thought, you create mental flexibility. Instead of saying, this is who I am, you say, this is a thought I'm having. That small shift creates distance. Distance creates choice. You no longer have to obey every narrative your mind produces. You can acknowledge the thought and still act differently. You can feel doubt and still show up. You can hear the story and choose not to follow it. Questioning the story also reveals how selective the mind is. It highlights failures but minimizes wins. It remembers criticism but forgets praise. It recalls hesitation but ignores courage. This selective memory creates a distorted self-image. When you actively question negative narratives, you rebalance the picture. You start noticing evidence of competence, resilience, and progress that was always there but rarely acknowledged. The story changes not because you lied to yourself, but because you finally told the whole truth. This practice does not eliminate negative thoughts. It reduces their authority. Thoughts can still arise, but they no longer dictate your actions. They become suggestions, not commands. You learn to treat them like passing commentary instead of absolute instruction. This is where emotional strength develops, not in controlling what you think, but in deciding what you believe. Over time, questioning your inner stories builds trust in yourself. You stop abandoning your goals at the first sign of discomfort. You stop assuming that fear means stop. You stop confusing anxiety with intuition. You realize that many of the limits you accepted were never real barriers. They were narratives left unexamined. And once examined, they lose their power. The most important realization is this: you are not broken for having negative thoughts. You are human. The work is not to silence the mind, but to stop letting it tell unchecked stories about your worth, your future, and your potential. Every time you ask, is this proven or is this assumed, you reclaim a piece of your agency. You move from being a passive listener to an active editor of your inner dialogue. When the story changes, behavior changes. When behavior changes, results change, not overnight, not magically, but steadily. The mind learns new patterns through repetition as well. Questioning weak stories repeatedly builds stronger ones. Stories grounded in evidence, growth, and possibility. And slowly, without force, the old narratives fade. Not because you fought them, but because they could no longer survive the light of awareness. Positive thinking sounds good, but without action, it quickly becomes noise. The mind is not convinced by words alone. You can repeat affirmations in the mirror every morning, tell yourself you are confident, disciplined, or unstoppable, but if your behavior doesn't match the statement, your brain rejects it. Not consciously, but quietly. It knows the difference between hope and proof. That is why empty positivity often feels fake. It creates a gap between what you say and what you do, and the brain always believes what you do. Belief is built on evidence. Every action you take is a vote for the kind of person you think you are. When you follow through on a promise, even a small one, you send a powerful signal to your nervous system, I am reliable. When you break a promise, you send the opposite message. Over time, these signals accumulate. They form your self-image. Confidence is not something you install with words. It is something you earn through consistency. And the brain keeps score whether you are paying attention or not. Affirmations fail when they try to overwrite reality instead of shaping it. Saying, I am disciplined, while avoiding hard tasks creates internal conflict. The mind resists that contradiction. It responds with doubt, not belief. But when you say less and do more, the mind aligns. You don't need to tell yourself you are strong if you keep showing up on days you want to quit. You don't need to tell yourself you are confident if you repeatedly act despite fear. The brain draws its conclusions from behavior, not intention. Keeping small promises to yourself may sound insignificant, but it is one of the most powerful ways to rewire belief. Big promises are easy to make and easy to break. Small promises are manageable, repeatable, and trustworthy. Waking up when you said you would. Finishing a task you committed to. Taking the walk, writing the page, making the call. Each completed promise becomes evidence. Evidence turns into trust, and self-trust is the foundation of real confidence. Discomfort is the gateway to this process. If the action is comfortable, it does not challenge identity. Growth requires friction. When you do what you said you would do even while your emotions argue against it, you teach your brain a new rule. Feelings do not control behavior. This is where belief shifts. The brain updates its model of who you are, not based on how you feel, but on what you do under pressure. Motivation comes and goes. Evidence stays. Many people wait for motivation to act. But motivation is unreliable. It is influenced by mood, energy, and circumstance. Evidence, on the other hand, is cumulative. You don't need to feel motivated to collect it. You just need to act. One small action creates proof. Proof creates belief. Belief fuels further action. This is how momentum is built, not through hype, but through follow through. When you rely on affirmations alone, you are asking your brain to believe something without proof. When you build evidence, you give it data. And the brain loves data. It adapts quickly when presented with consistent patterns. Show it that you finish what you start, and it will begin to expect completion. Show it that you act despite discomfort, and it will start to associate challenge with capability instead of threat. This is not optimism, it is conditioning. Evidence also changes how you talk to yourself. Instead of saying, I hope I can do this, you start saying, I've handled hard things before. Instead of, I'm trying to be consistent, you say, I show up. These statements are not affirmations, they are observations. They are grounded in experience. That is why they feel solid. The mind accepts them without resistance because they are true. There will be days when you fail to keep a promise. That does not erase your progress unless you let it. Evidence is built over time, not in perfection. What matters is the trend, not the exception. The mistake many people make is turning one slip into a new identity. They abandon the process instead of returning to it. The strongest evidence builders are not those who never fall off track, but those who get back on track quickly. As you accumulate evidence, your need for external validation decreases. You don't need constant reassurance because you have internal proof. You trust yourself because you have earned that trust. This quiet confidence does not announce itself. It does not seek approval. It shows up, does the work, and moves on. It is resilient because it is based on reality, not mood. The most powerful shift happens when action becomes your language. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop explaining why things are hard. You simply do what you said you would do. Not perfectly, not dramatically, consistently. And each time you do, you reinforce a new belief about who you are. Over time, that belief becomes automatic. Confidence built this way does not collapse under pressure. It does not disappear when someone doubts you or when circumstances change. It is not dependent on praise or success. It is rooted in self-respect. And self-respect comes from honoring your word to yourself. That is why evidence rewires belief faster than motivation ever will. Motivation is emotional. Evidence is structural. One fades, the other stays. When you stop trying to convince yourself with words and start proving things with action, everything changes. The mind stops arguing. Doubt quiets down, not because life becomes easy, but because you have shown yourself repeatedly that you can be trusted. And that trust becomes the strongest foundation you will ever build. Your mind does not operate in isolation. It is constantly being shaped, influenced, and trained by what you feed it every day. Conversations you listen to, content you scroll through, the environments you sit in, the voices you allow close to you, none of these are neutral. They leave impressions, they set tones. They quietly program the way you think about yourself and the world. If your inner dialogue feels anxious, critical, or heavy, it is worth asking what kind of material has been repeatedly entering your mental space. The brain is a pattern-absorbing machine. It learns through exposure, not intention. You may not consciously agree with everything you hear or see, but repetition makes an impact regardless. Constant exposure to fear-based news trains the mind to expect danger. Endless comparison on social platforms trains the mind to feel behind. Negative conversations normalize complaint and helplessness. Over time, these inputs become the background noise of your thinking. They shape what feels normal, what feels possible, and what feels threatening. Self-talk often sounds personal, but much of it is borrowed. The critical voice in your head may not have started with you. It could be an echo of past environments, repeated opinions, or dominant narratives you've absorbed without question. When negativity surrounds you, it becomes internal language. The mind mirrors its environment. Just as a body reflects the food it consumes, the mind reflects the content it digests. This is why changing your inner world often begins with changing your outer one. You cannot constantly immerse yourself in fear and expect calm. You cannot swim in comparison and expect confidence. You cannot surround yourself with people who constantly doubt, complain, or belittle growth and expect to feel inspired. Willpower alone is not enough to override constant exposure. The nervous system adapts to what it encounters most frequently. Choosing your inputs carefully is not about pretending the world is perfect or avoiding reality. It is about recognizing influence. Not everything deserves your attention. Not every opinion deserves space in your head. Attention is a limited resource. Where you place it determines what grows. If you give your attention to content that reinforces scarcity, drama, or hopelessness, those themes will dominate your thinking. If you give your attention to ideas that emphasize learning, responsibility, and progress, those themes begin to take root. Your conversations matter more than you think. The people you regularly speak with shape your perception of what is normal. If the dominant tone is complaint, blame, and fear, you will unconsciously adopt that lens. If the dominant tone is accountability, curiosity, and forward movement, your thinking naturally shifts in that direction. This does not mean cutting people off harshly. It means being intentional. You can limit exposure without judgment. You can protect your mental space without explanation. Content consumption works the same way. What you watch before bed, what you scroll through when you wake up, what you listen to during downtime, these moments quietly set your emotional baseline. Fear-driven headlines, endless arguments, and curated images of other people's lives distort perspective. They pull attention outward and weaken focus inward. Over time, the mind becomes reactive instead of reflective. You start responding to noise instead of acting with clarity. Environment is another powerful input. Physical spaces influence mental states. Clutter creates mental friction. Chaos increases stress. Calm spaces invite calm thinking. Even small changes, light, order, cleanliness, send signals to the brain about safety and control. When the environment feels intentional, the mind follows. When you change your inputs, the shift in inner dialogue is often subtle but steady. You may not notice it immediately, but over time the tone changes. The mind becomes less aggressive, less rushed, less critical. New questions replace old accusations. Instead of, what's wrong with me? You start asking, what can I adjust? Instead of, I'm behind, you think, I'm in progress. This happens not through force, but through exposure. Many people try to fix negative thinking directly, battling thoughts one by one. But thoughts are downstream, inputs are upstream. Change what flows in, and what flows out changes naturally. This approach is more sustainable because it works with the brain, not against it. The brain adapts to its environment. Give it better material, and it builds better patterns. This also applies to what you repeatedly tell yourself. Self-talk is an input too. If your internal language is harsh and unforgiving, it reinforces stress and avoidance. When you become aware of that tone and soften it, not with empty positivity, but with constructive honesty, you create a healthier mental climate. The goal is not constant positivity, but consistent alignment with growth. Choosing your inputs carefully is an act of self-respect. It is acknowledging that your mind is valuable and influence matters. You don't have to consume everything available. You don't have to engage with every opinion. You get to decide what deserves access to your attention. And that decision, repeated daily, shapes who you become. Over time, as your inputs improve, your emotional resilience increases. You respond instead of react. You think instead of spiral. You feel grounded instead of overwhelmed. Not because life stops presenting challenges, but because your mind is no longer constantly trained on threat and comparison. The most important thing to understand is that inner change does not always start inside. Often it starts with what you allow around you. When you curate your conversations, content, and environments with intention, your inner dialogue begins to shift on its own. Calm replaces chaos, clarity replaces noise, and gradually, without forcing it, your mind becomes a place that supports you instead of sabotaging you. Many people believe that harshness is the key to improvement. They think that if they criticize themselves enough, push hard enough, and show no mercy for mistakes, they will eventually become better. But this belief misunderstands how growth actually works. Beating yourself up does not create strength. It creates fear. It shrinks your willingness to try. It makes effort feel dangerous. When the voice in your head is cruel, your mind goes into protection mode, not progress mode. You don't grow faster under threat. You grow slower or not at all. Growth happens in safe environments. This is true in learning, relationships, and personal development. When people feel psychologically safe, they take risks, ask questions, and try again after failure. When they feel shame, they hide, avoid, and give up. The same rule applies to the environment inside your mind. If your inner dialogue is constantly attacking you, your system stays tense. Energy is spent on defense instead of development. Compassion creates the safety required for real change. Self-compassion is often misunderstood as softness or excuse-making. It is neither. Compassion does not mean ignoring responsibility or lowering standards. It means addressing mistakes without cruelty. It means acknowledging difficulty without adding insult. When you make an error and respond with understanding instead of shame, you stay engaged. You remain willing to learn. You keep moving forward. Shame, on the other hand, turns a single mistake into an identity. It says, this happened because you are flawed, instead of, this happened because you are learning. The way you speak to yourself shapes your nervous system. A harsh inner voice triggers stress responses. It narrows thinking, it reduces creativity and problem solving. Compassionate self-talk does the opposite. It calms the system, it widens perspective. It makes it easier to reflect honestly and adjust. This is not emotional theory, it is how the brain works. The brain performs best when it feels supported, not attacked. Think about how you would speak to someone you genuinely want to see succeed. You would be honest, but not cruel. You would correct, but not humiliate. You would encourage effort, not perfection. You would focus on progress, not punishment. That tone creates motivation. That tone builds trust. And trust is essential for discipline. Without trust, discipline feels like force. With trust, discipline feels like commitment. Discipline built on shame is fragile. It works temporarily, fueled by fear and self-criticism, but it collapses under pressure. The moment you slip, shame convinces you that the effort was pointless. Discipline built on respect is resilient. When you respect yourself, you don't abandon the process after a setback. You return to it, you adjust and continue. Respect keeps you consistent long after motivation fades. Many people delay compassion until they feel successful, believing they must earn kindness. But compassion is not a reward, it is a requirement. Waiting to be kind to yourself until you improve is like refusing to water a plant until it grows. Compassion is the soul, plan is the structure that grows within it. Without nourishment, structure breaks. This approach changes how you handle failure. Instead of spiraling into self-attack, you ask better questions. What went wrong? What can I learn? What can I do differently next time? These questions keep you engaged in the process. They move you towards solutions instead of self-punishment. When mistakes are met with curiosity instead of cruelty, learning accelerates. Practicing compassion before discipline also prevents burnout. Constant self-pressure without understanding leads to exhaustion. People push hard, ignore their limits, and then collapse. Compassion allows you to pace yourself. It helps you recognize when to rest and when to push. This balance makes discipline sustainable. Sustainable effort beats extreme effort every time. As your inner environment becomes kinder, your relationship with effort changes. You stop associating work with punishment. You start associating it with self-respect. You show up not because you hate where you are, but because you care about where you are going. This shift is powerful. It replaces self-violence with self-leadership. Over time, compassionate discipline builds quiet confidence. You trust yourself because you know you will not abandon or abuse yourself when things get hard. You know you can face challenges without self-destruction. That trust increases courage. You take on harder goals because failure no longer feels like a threat to your worth. The strongest people are not the ones who are hardest on themselves. They are the ones who can be honest without being cruel. They hold themselves accountable without stripping themselves of dignity. They correct course without collapsing into shame. This balance is what allows growth to continue over the long term. When you speak to yourself with respect, you create an internal environment that supports effort. Discipline stops feeling like force and starts feeling like alignment. You do the work not to punish yourself, but to honor your potential. And in that environment, one built on compassion first, real lasting growth finally becomes possible. The mind is rarely ready when growth is required. It hesitates, questions, delays, and looks for certainty before allowing movement. It asks for guarantees that do not exist. If you wait for confidence, clarity, or motivation to arrive before you act, you will spend most of your life waiting. Readiness is a feeling, and feelings are unreliable. They shift with mood, energy, and fear. Action, on the other hand, is concrete. It creates information. It moves you out of imagination and into reality. That is why acting before the mind agrees is not reckless, it is necessary. The mind's job is to keep you safe, not to make you successful. When something is unfamiliar or challenging, it sounds the alarm. Doubt appears. Negative self-talk gets louder. Worst case scenarios feel convincing. This does not mean you are unprepared. It means you are at the edge of growth. The mistake people make is interpreting mental resistance as a stop sign. In most cases, it is not a warning, it is a threshold. Waiting to feel confident is a trap because confidence is not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct of it. Confidence is built from experience. Experience only comes from doing. When you reverse the order and demand confidence first, you block the very process that creates it. Action breaks the stalemate. It forces engagement. It replaces imagined outcomes with real feedback. And real feedback is always more useful than endless speculation. Clarity works the same way. People say they are waiting to figure things out before they begin. But clarity does not come from thinking alone. Thinking without action creates loops. You go over the same fears, the same questions, the same doubts, and nothing changes. Action introduces new data. It shows you what works, what doesn't, and what needs adjustment. Even imperfect action creates direction. Stillness creates confusion. Every time you act despite negative self-talk, you weaken its authority. The mind learns from behavior. If you wait every time it complains, you teach it that hesitation works. It will complain louder next time. But if you move forward while it protests, you teach it a different lesson, that its objections are not commands. Over time, the mind adapts. It reduces resistance because resistance no longer controls outcomes. This is how courage is built. Not through affirmations or visualization, but through repeated proof that you can act even when afraid. Fear does not disappear first, it fades later. At the beginning, courage feels uncomfortable. It feels like moving with a shaking voice and a racing heart. But each active movement sends a signal to the brain. I survived this. That signal accumulates. The nervous system recalibrates. What once felt dangerous begins to feel manageable. The brain updates its beliefs based on evidence, not intention. When you act, you provide evidence. You show yourself that you can handle uncertainty. You demonstrate capability in real time. This evidence slowly overrides old narratives. The mind stops saying you can't as often, not because you argued with it, but because your behavior contradicted it. Behavior is the strongest form of persuasion. Acting before the mind agrees also prevents over-identification with thoughts. When you are stuck in your head, thoughts feel powerful and personal. When you move your body, make a call, start the task, or take the step, thoughts lose intensity. Action grounds you in the present moment. It shifts focus from imagined futures to current effort. This reduces anxiety and increases control. There will be times when action feels messy and uncertain. That is not a sign to stop. That is a sign you are learning. Progress is rarely smooth at the beginning. Expecting smoothness is another form of delay. When you accept that early action will feel awkward, you stop interpreting discomfort as failure. You keep moving, and movement creates momentum. Momentum is important because it carries you through moments when motivation is low. Once you are in motion, continuing requires less energy than starting. The hardest part is often the first step, taken while the mind is still arguing. But that step changes the conversation. It shifts you from debate to experience. And experience always speaks louder than doubt. Acting before the mind agrees does not mean ignoring wisdom or acting impulsively. It means recognizing the difference between caution and avoidance. Caution considers risk and prepares. Avoidance disguises fear as logic. The only way to tell the difference is through action. Small, deliberate steps allow you to test reality instead of assuming it. As you practice this, you build trust in yourself. You learn that you do not need to feel ready to begin. You only need to be willing to be uncomfortable, willing to be imperfect, willing to move. This trust becomes a quiet strength. You stop negotiating with fear. You acknowledge it and move anyway. Over time, the mind catches up. It becomes quieter, not because it was silenced, but because it learned a new pattern. It learned that action leads to growth, not danger. Confidence begins to appear, not as excitement, but as steadiness. Clarity emerges not as certainty, but as direction. The most important shifts in life rarely happen after you feel ready. They happen because you decided to act while you still felt unsure. Each time you do the thing while the mind hesitates, you reclaim a little more control. You teach yourself that progress is created through movement, not permission. And eventually, the mind stops asking for proof and starts following your lead.